2021, I think it was. And certainly, Black Lives Matter was leading the charge, and TKC was down with us, and I can recall both organizations going to polling places to be certain that people stayed in line, giving them food, giving them water, whatever they needed. You know, we had the party at the polls, we had the music going, everything we could do to encourage people to vote. And then the Secretary of State for the state of Georgia found out what we were doing down in Bladen, found out what we were doing down in these rural parts of Georgia, and came out and made the proclamation that if I see anybody giving anybody as much as a cup of coffee, we're going to lock them up. Yeah. This, of course, is before the new legislation that they passed. And so when we hear secretaries of states taking those types of actions, particularly in Georgia, with what was going on in 2021 in Georgia, and seeing where we are now, where it looks like it's now becoming even more pronounced, with more states that are trying to take similar positions to make it hard for folks to be able to cast their votes. Should we be focusing on federal legislation still? Should we be focusing on the states? What should we be doing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the short answer is both and, right? We've got to focus on the state legislation. I'm going to tell you a quick story about that, but we've also got to continue to focus on the federal legislation. I wanted to give a quick add-on, a friendly amendment to, and I agree with everything that everybody said, fully co-sign on what everybody said. Something that Secretary Chapman said, you were talking about how these groups are out there, right? And they're well organized. Part of the reason they're well organized is because they're well funded.
Right.
And one of their, by the right, obviously, right? And so one of our core beliefs that Black voters matter is that in order for Black voters to matter, that the organizations that serve our communities, that organize in our communities, the churches, the League of Women Voters chapters, all of these organizations, the neighborhood associations have got to be just as well resourced as the people that we are organizing against, right? Or who are organizing against us and our rights. And that's an important thing for us to remember, because sometimes we just kind of expect, and when I say we, not just like in the community, but like even members of government, even members of Congress, even a president expects folks to just out-organize voter suppression without having the resources in the very groups that do this work every day. We call it the 365 work. And so I just wanted to add that friendly amendment. But to your question, yeah, it takes organizing for both the federal legislation, and I want to say this, even in a situation, right, and we're not naive, we understand the makeup of Congress right now, but we have to be just as aggressive at continuing to push for federal legislation as the other side was aggressive for 8 years trying to overturn Obamacare and having 60 or 70 votes in 1 year, even when they knew they didn't have the votes.
Right.
Because you got to continue to push, you got to continue to keep it on the table, you got to continue to present your agenda and your vision, although theirs is wrong, right, and anti-people and anti-human rights, but the strategy was a correct strategy. And we've got to be willing to do the same thing so that when 2024 comes around, and when hopefully January 1st, 2025 comes around and Congress looks different and we have some people there that actually support voting rights, we're not having to then flip a switch of turn on what we had ignored for 2 years just because we didn't have the numbers, right? We got to continue to keep that push for federal legislation. But in the meantime, we got to also have the fight going on at the state level. And that means in both situations, where we have power, Pennsylvania, Michigan, right? There's a difference between a blue state and a progressive state, right? Those two things are not synonymous. And so where we have power, we've got to force folks who at least on paper say they support voting rights to actually do something about it and use their power to pass their own state level voting rights. Because that's how we create the kind of, again, along with pushing for the federal, when we pass things at the state level, that builds the momentum. We've seen this on issue after issue. Marriage equality, marijuana legalization, Fight for 15. When states and localities take up these things and pass them at the local and state level, you eventually build a momentum that forces Congress to deal with it, that forces the White House to deal with it, that forces even a conservative Supreme Court to acknowledge that everybody has the right to marry whoever they want to marry, right? But it takes action at all levels in order to create that situation. We got to fight for that in states where we have power, and even in the states where there's not a friendly environment, we still got to fight. We are fighting right now in Georgia because, as Darrell said, they are trying to double down on SB 202. We called SB 202 Jim Crow 2.0, and now they got Jim Crow 2.2 or 2.3 or whatever the latest version is. They got to upgrade on voter suppression every year. And so right now, before they tried to just limit drop boxes, now they're trying to eliminate drop boxes.
Right.
Before they tried to just make it a little bit easier for people to bring blanket challenges, trying to go up and have like a list with 50,000 predominantly black voters on it in order to get them wiped off the rolls. Now they've doubled down on that and trying to make it even easier. All you got to do is they've lowered the burden of proof. All you got to do is show that there's some names that on some change of address registry, and that in and of itself is enough for you to take somebody off the voter roll. So they are taking everything that they did in SB 202 and they're making it even worse. And this is happening right now. We can't let the narrative, and I'm going to end with this, we can't let the narrative that came out of the recent elections that democracy was saved because Arizona, voted a certain way, which was good. I'm glad they did, right? I'm glad Michigan got what are we right now? We C3? See what are we? Yeah, I'm glad that Michigan has people that support voting rights, regardless of party, right? I'm glad that people that support voting rights are in office. But at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that democracy was saved, right? Because the slow motion insurrection is still going on. They are still taking over states. They are still trying to pass more voter suppression. They are still in Jackson trying to create a whole district to take away voting power from the predominantly black citizens of Jackson, who still don't have water, by the way. And even worse, they are continuing their attacks, and I'd be remiss because everywhere we go, we always say this, right? There's different aspects of voting, and there's different voting rights legislation. There's John Lewis Voting Rights Act. There's Freedom to Vote Act, right? But there's also D.C. statehood.
All right now.
And I say it all the time, that the denial of the full right to vote to the 700,000 residents of D.C. is one of the oldest forms of voter suppression. And to see President Biden say, unsolicited, oh, if you pass this bill that's going to overturn what the voted, elected leaders of D.C. say that they want to see, if you pass that, I'm going to sign it, right? Nobody even asked him to say it, right? Just unsolicited, right? We tried to get him to say some stuff about the filibuster for a long time, and he went a whole year not saying nothing, and then out the blue, without somebody even asking, just, hey, if you pass that thing on D.C., I'm gonna sign it. I support home rule, but I'm gonna sign something that helps to overturn local legislation that local elected officials signed, right? That's voter suppression. And so we need to fight on all of these levels, and we have to fight where we have power to do the good stuff, and we have to continue to fight in the states where people are trying to take our rights away. We need to continue to resist that and expose that every chance we have.
Amen.
And consistently.
Yes.
Right. Persistent.
One of the interesting things from what you were laying out is that not to give up on the congressional level, not to give up on the federal level, trying to get voting rights passed. And there's an interesting strategy that I think that exists that's out there, and I'd love to hear the panelists' views on this. And that is that there's something that they call the Biden 18.
Uh-oh. Watch out.
18 House districts that President Biden won that currently have Republicans that are sitting in Congress, or anti-voting rights people that are sitting in those seats. And I'm wondering, should there be a concentrated effort on those seats, on those 18 votes that are there, to try to push them on voting rights to get legislation moved out of the House and over to the Senate? And do you think it could be successful? And is it something that we should be informed?
Right.
Whoever wants to jump in.
So, is this working? Can you hear? It's not working. No.
No, just push it the other way.
Now,
There you go.
so I would take it for a little bit further than that, but I think the 18 Senate seats, yes, you want to look at those seats that are vulnerable. You want to be able to figure out where you can meet people, but understanding how hostile this Congress is. Congress right now has 150 election deniers in Congress. You have 39 people in the House who actively participated in trying to participate in January 6th. You have far-right extremists. And this is a fact. This is not a partisan take on this, because we are a nonpartisan organization, although we do have policies and positions. So those 18, the threat and fear that they are under by the Republican caucus is very real. So that means that we have to go into the communities that they were elected in, and we have to do deep organizing. Because doing it at the federal level is not the solution. You need their voters who are pressing them. That's who they are listening to. Everybody has in Congress, well, in the House at least, has to run every 2 years.
Right,
They spend a majority of that time trying to raise money to get reelected.
right.
So when you impact people where their money is by targeting their donors, and you impact them where they think they will lose their election. So that's the organizing strategy in my mind behind it. But I would also add that it's not just the House. Remember, you had last year when we were fighting for the Freedom to Vote Act, we had 2 Democratic senators who refused to vote to remove the filibuster as an impediment. And we know filibuster, has been an impediment historically to passing civil rights legislation. We know that it has been used and weaponized time and time again against Black and brown people. So we also have to figure out how we are targeting those individuals. Now, one of them is no longer claiming that they are a Democrat.
She never was.
But there is a majority in the Senate. That doesn't solve the filibuster issue. But coming up in 2024, there are 33 seats in the Senate side that are coming up for re-election. Many of those are also vulnerable Democrats. There are also vulnerable Republicans. So again, the strategy is, in my mind, hitting people where it hurts. Now, there are also all kinds of elections when it comes to campaign finance and all the other issues, because we know that corporations have a voice in election, and we also know that there's a lot of dark money out there. So there are intermediate pieces of legislation that I think we can focus on passing, like the Disclose Act, for example, which would make more transparency available so we know who those donors are who are contributing those resources. So there are a lot of other pieces of legislation that are accompanying pieces of legislation that nobody's really paying attention to that play into that work.
And, interestingly, one of the things that, and I agree wholeheartedly with what you've been laying out with regards to where to attack. Go to their home, go to their voting base, and make them answer to their voters.
Yes.
And you're sort of forcing them to choose between the people that put them in office and those with whom they're serving in office, and let them choose which way. But the Supreme Court just came out with a decision dealing with the independent state legislature theory. That theory is saying that when a state legislature makes a decision regarding voting issues, that the court system in that state should have no reason, no ability to touch whatever the legislature puts in place. And in the Supreme Court's decision, non-decision, in the Supreme Court's non-decision, what they decided was that they were sending it back, that they said it's not right because it hadn't finished up in this particular case in North Carolina with regards to the determination. And what was going on there is that we had a conservative state legislature that was just creating maps and requirements that were just out of this world in favor of one party, right? And not balanced whatsoever in terms of its implementation. And so when we start looking at, in the case of Moore versus Tucker, when we start looking at what's getting ready to happen in North Carolina, or right? Where the court system there that initially made the decision was, I believe it was a 5-4 or something like that. It was determined by a liberal justice who was subsequently lost that election, and now they have a conservative base that's there. What is this setting the groundwork for in North Carolina, and what message then is the Supreme Court sending with regard to states and voting rights?
Well, you know, it's a fascinating problem, right? Because about a month ago, all of us who are lawyers were, what the hell did North Carolina just do? When after the election, they turned around and vacated, meaning took away any legal effect of 2 decisions that the court had just issued, and in a couple of years previous, and that's almost unheard of. It's rarely. I mean, I can't even. I was trying to really go back and think through, all my legal training, all the cases, etc. It's rare. I really could not come up with anything except for, some clear error of law or something where the court had been deceived. I was trying to think of where have I seen this before, but they did it for political reasons because they disagreed, the new majority, with the previous decision. Now in law, we spend a heck of a lot of time studying what's called precedents, stare decisis, which means that you cannot just for political reasons up and change the law. That the law has to be changed on the basis of some legal theory that are some, factual basis that demands, some reconsideration. But they vacated. They just threw the decisions out. And so Daryl and I were talking about what the hell does this mean? Besides the fact that they're going to decide the cases the wrong way next time, as soon as they can. But what happened in the interim was they forgot that the Supreme Court has a rule. And the Supreme Court rule is basically that if a case is to be determined by the Supreme Court of the United States coming out of a state court, that decision has to be final. So when you vacate the decision, there is no decision. There's no ground whatsoever for the Supreme Court now to consider the Moore case, because the original decision that came to them as final is no longer existent, not to mention not final. So they basically wrote a paragraph this week and sent it back to North Carolina and said, why should we be even considering this case? Which is, a fascinating kind of rigmarole, legal nonsense. But the bottom line is that that's how determined they are to want to decide the North Carolina voter ID case, to make strict voter ID the reality in North Carolina, and that's how determined they are to gerrymander the legislature in North Carolina. Now, April probably could do it 1,000 times better than I can, to talk about this whole independent state legislative doctrine and all of its nonsense. But what we got to understand, though, what's critical here, and I was looking for where this attack was going to come from, is that we have always pointed out that under the U.S. Constitution, that Congress has total authority. They don't use it. They don't use it a lot. to determine federal elections. This whole independent state theory, legislative.
Historically black institutions that or organizations that are accepting money, big numbers, from these corporate donors.
Oh boy, I gotten hot up here. Where's the fan? Where's the fan?
And these corporate donors, are not fans of voting rights.
Yeah.
Particularly in Georgia, not fans of voting rights. Support candidates that are openly opposed. Can you share with us what you think and understand accepting what I call the dark money? What impact does that have as we're pushing forward, trying to have voting rights?
You want to start? Go ahead and start.
You want me to start? So a couple of thoughts. I think that this question, and we did a whole thing on this whole corporate accountability issue when the Georgia bill was being floated. We tried to call out corporations like Coca-Cola and Delta and Home Depot. And it made national news, and eventually like hundreds of corporations came out signing things saying, oh yeah, we support democracy. But there was no action that followed, except for a handful. And there's a handful of companies that we could recognize who did a really good job. Patagonia and Levi Strauss, and not even just in terms of like what they were doing, but also advocating within the corporate world. But the bigger question that you're getting to is just really this more conceptual question around the involvement of money in politics. And I think part of what we have to deal with is that there's some very specific issues of voting rights that we have to deal with. There's again reinforcing, not just reinforcing, but expanding the 1965 Voting Rights Act, right? There's dealing with gerrymandering and all of that. But there are some very specific democratic reforms that this country needs, right? One of which, speaking of the court, is we've got to expand the court. It's no longer a legitimate court. So it's got to be expanded. But there's some very basic democratic reforms that have got to be dealt with, issues that deal with campaign finance, right? And again, this is something that can be done at the federal level, but even at the state level, right? You got states like New York that are actually going backwards on this issue. They approved a public financing system that the New York State Legislature is now trying to undo and defund. They can't defund the police, but they can defund the public campaign finance system. And so there's some states that are actually going backwards on this. But the point being that there's some basic democratic reforms we need to look at. The nature of the court, the nature of campaign finance, even the nature of how we elect people to Congress. There's nothing in the Constitution that says it's got to be done this way, like that's the only way that it's been done. There are things like proportional representation that many of us know in here, many of our legal scholars know. It's something that Lonnie Guinier used to talk about. There's an act right now pending called the Fair Representation Act that would say, we don't have to do single member districts. We can have multiple member districts that are elected proportionally, which would allow for a few things. It would allow for minor parties, third parties to have more say. It would allow for a different type of campaigning, not as partisan, or at least not as bipartisan, or not as whatever, just two parties fighting against each other. So there are some very basic democratic reforms that we have got to start to talk about. We've got to expand what this fight is that we're up against. And those two worlds that often don't really coexist well, right? Like the traditional voting rights world and then the democracy reform world, a lot of times they don't mix, right? There's a little intersection. If it's a Venn diagram, it's got a little space in there. But we got to figure out a way for those two worlds to exist and to work together, because the issues that we're up against, and this is where I'm going to end it, everything that we're talking about, the independent legislature theory, in Georgia right now, one of the things that this word unprecedented, all this stuff that we talk about as being unprecedented. In Georgia right now, there's a redistricting scheme that they did where for the first time ever, usually there's what they call a gentleman's agreement that says, that the state legislature will do maps that are recommended by the local delegation in the legislature, right? and for the first time ever, this Republican legislature ignored one of those local delegations in Cobb County, and they're redrawing maps specifically to get rid of a black woman that's in a seat there, right? There's all these examples. You know, you gave the example of the North Carolina court, which is going back to relook at 2 cases that were just decided, right? And so all this stuff that we call, what we have learned, and the former occupant of the White House really exposed this. There's a lot of stuff in this democracy that is really just kind of based on a handshake. It's really just based on the honor system, right? And what these people now are showing is they don't care. All they care about is unadulterated power. They don't care about ignoring precedent and the way things have always been, or the way things should be, or what's right and fair, and what's even truth and honest, and what's history. They don't care. All they care about is power. And so what we have got to ask is, what are we willing to do? Right? What are we willing to do to show the power that we have? So we say this, and we said this all throughout 2021, and many of us here in this room did this. Yes, we got to make phone calls. Yes, we got to send text messages. Yes, we have to vote. We have to vote. Somebody say, we got to vote.
We got to vote.
We got to vote. We got to do all that. But y'all, we are in Selma, Alabama, which changed not just this country and not just this world, but they changed it not by voting. They changed it in those streets.
Right.
They changed it on that bridge. They changed it by fighting and bleeding, and yes, some folk dying for it, and I'm not suggesting that any of us should or want to die for what we're fighting against, but we got to ask ourselves, how far are we willing to go to match the power that these folks are showing us that they are willing to use unapologetically? We've got to be just as unapologetic in pursuit of love and in pursuit of justice as the other side is in pursuit of wrong.
My mind. My mind. My mind. My mind.
But I would say, just to add on a little bit, the Citizens United decision that allowed corporations to have a voice in our country has destroyed the way that our politics
The worst decision. The worst decision.
So those issues around money and politics really are very much at the core of our democracy. And so we have to figure out, how do we, again, get people into office who do not have access to that corporate money.
Yes.
So there are, at the state level, what people can do is work on campaign finance, not only campaign finance rules, but making sure that we have an equitable way for people who don't have access to be able to run for office. It's also, again, we talk about resources all the time, the collective pooling of our resources and really putting it in. Oftentimes people will give to their local, something else, humane society, whatever, and I'm not saying that those are important causes. I love dogs too. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we are investing in candidates who can actually make change.
Right.
The other thing I would say, and this is where I call in my friends in the civil rights community, because if we really want to stand up to those corporations, many of us, many of our friends, take the guilt money. After George Floyd was murdered, corporations were throwing money at civil rights groups. To say that they stand up for Black lives. So that they could exploit those civil rights organizations, those people who had been adversely impacted. These are the same corporations who are funding candidates at the federal level and lobbying, using that money to do harmful legislation. In the form of economic,
come on
about economic violence.
That's right. That's right.
It's been since 2009 that we haven't had a minimum wage increase in this country. I don't know anything about the $7.25 an hour.
Right.
But $15 an hour minimum wage is no longer sufficient when you put in inflation.
Nope.
So when we think about corporate violence, in my mind, that is a form of corporate violence in my mind.
That's right.
And so we have to be very strategic in using the solutions and the tools that we have. And Dr. Turner talked earlier about working in coalition. Coalition needs to hold one another accountable so that we are all walking and talking in the same direction. Because we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And we can do this. Oftentimes we find ourselves tethered to that money equally because we want to do the good work and there's never enough money to do the good work. But you know what? Cooperatives exist for a reason.
That's right. That's right. Come on. Come on, Virginia. Come on.
All right now. Amen to everything she just said. Because she really talked about commitment violence. But I also just want to piggyback off of what Virginia just said and really also just stress too that sometimes we don't have to have people run for office. We need to train people to help those candidates become campaign operatives. Because that's also empowering Black and brown candidates to have people in place who are going to be, who they can trust. Yes. We're going to learn how to run those campaigns. We're going to get out there and make sure they have the resources. We're going to get out there and help fundraise for them. We're going to get out there and have trust the resources. So it's not just always having them run for office, it's also having campaign operatives who are in place. And then also I think it goes back and I mean just continuing, like there's so much economic violence that is happening that we don't think about. And we really have to think about that when we're looking at corporate finance. And we also have to think about that, and I'm gonna say it because it hasn't been said, but I'll just say it. You know, just because it's within our community don't mean it's always good, right?
Say that.
And so, you know, we have to look at that too and think about like, what is that looking like, and why are we also sometimes willing to just take it to help ourselves advance? So we have to stop and think, how is this really working in our issues, and how is it, like Virginia said, impacting our community to move us forward? Because in the long run, we have to look at our sustainability and not just like temporary. We don't want performative people in our community, you know, like sometimes we have to really look at that and just really hold people accountable. Accountability. And so that's all I really want to say is accountability is really super important in this work. And we can't be afraid to hold people accountable.
That's right.
Well, you know, thank you. And, you know, I don't think, folks, that we're going to have the political success that we need as long as we allow pretenders to operate in our space.
Come on now.
Yeah. You know, and, you know, I mean, it's as
Calling names today.
tone deaf as the White House was on the FTVA for the longest in the filibuster. They were tone damn deaf and wouldn't listen. And, you know, and as bad as that was, you know, I really blame a lot of the organizations too, who sat on their damn asses and did nothing, and you know, cut deals behind our backs, who you know, who did not attempt to really push as Selma. What is the lesson of Selma? Come on, how can we be so stupid? Because the whole lesson of Selma was King says to Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, we need a Voting Rights Act. He said, well, make me do it. He says, you find some way to make me pass a Voting Rights Act. Give me something to work with. And King says, yeah, got you. But the people here in Selma were moving on their own trajectory, right? And they were already saying, they didn't care what anybody told them, SCLC, nobody. They wanted to move because somebody had killed Jimmy Lee Jackson. And they weren't going to be stopped. John Lewis isn't great because he marched on the Pettus Bridge. John Lewis is great because when he told Snick that he was going to walk with the community, they told him, you'll lose your chairmanship if you do that. And he looked at them and said, what, Daryl? So be it. He said, so be it. But I will not leave the people of Selma out by themselves. He says, I have to be there. Hosea Williams, and I mean, they all had this big battle, this big debate. The result was that he stood firm and he went to Selma. And Hosea Williams came with him and others. Don't get these stories twisted. It took courage beyond courage. It took a sense of mission-driven passion that would not be deterred. And I'm sick of people, just sick of it, that, people will come here and play lip service to this history and not walk in the steps of a John Lewis tribute. And, and I just think that the movement, some groups need to, anyway. And we need new groups. Thank God there's a Black Voters Matters. There wasn't. How many years ago? 5 years? Wow, it's really that young. Whoa, 6 years ago. And we need groups of integrity. We need people who will say what needs to have been said and wasn't said to the Biden White House years ago. It is imperative that you look at who's where, who stands in what breach, who's fighting, how are they fighting. Nobody can threaten me about saying they're going to take away my money because they don't give it to me anyway, but no, I'm just teasing. I got some good donors, thank God. But I just want people to understand that there's something wrong when we become so corporatist, captured. Might as well be in a damn sale. Because all you think about is how do you protect your money, and you're not thinking about the causes that the people laid their lives down for who you stand on their places. I mean, I just think, I'm sorry, Daryl, I done gone off. But the bottom line is that there has to be more integrity, more spine, more willingness to fight if we're going to get what we need. Thank you.
Barbara raises a really interesting question, Madam Secretary, because one of the things that I find very interesting and challenging in terms of trying to figure it out is that a lot of times in some states, in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Supreme Court there outlawed dropboxes. There was a period in Pennsylvania that they did not have dropboxes. And it was the legislation that was urged by Barbara Armline to Senator there and some other folks that finally got some dropboxes in place for things to be able to roll. When we start putting pieces together and we understand what the Secretary of State in Georgia was the one trying to suppress TJC and BBM from getting people out to vote. When we look, though, at a state like Alabama that elects the Secretary of State, it's not a progressive state by any stretch of the imagination. What can activists do to push for voting rights legislation if you have a Secretary of State that's adverse to it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Dropboxes. I spent the majority of the last year fighting about ballot drop boxes. It's like they became like the boogeyman, and they're just a metal structure where that's usually has surveillance around it, where people, can cast their ballot and vote. I had a situation in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, which is actually has a high majority of Latino in that county. And the district attorney actually decided that there's too much voter fraud happening in these drop boxes, which is non-existent. And that he was going to place detectives outside of every single drop box in his county to question voters as they were dropping off their ballot, to make sure that they were really dropping off their own ballot, that they weren't stuffing these drop boxes. And I was really on my own in Pennsylvania as like the lone voice that was really fighting against this. I sent him a letter. I said, this is voter intimidation. You know, Lehigh County is a Section 203 county under the Voting Rights Act. They're required to have bilingual balloting materials, assistance. And we talked about voter intimidation in the last panel a little bit, but just the mere presence of having uniform or ununiformed officers at drop boxes is problematic. But that's a county by county decision, as I mentioned. The counties have control over that. So in addition to advocating at the state level with your Secretary of State, it's important to also, try to advocate and push back at the local level. But yeah, it's hard when secretaries of state are elected. A lot of them have political agendas. A lot of them see it as a stepping stone to run for U.S. Senate or governor or greater office. Some of them have no experience when it comes to running elections at all. So it's important that you are engaging with the office, that you are continuing to hold them accountable as well. But one thing I wanted to add to the conversation that I've been talking about, and I want to use this opportunity to talk to this audience about this, is as we look forward in 2024, we can do all we can when it comes to registering voters and making sure voters can cast their ballot. But the fight really is happening after the election with election certification.
Yes.
Yes.
And as someone who was inside overseeing an election, that's what keeps me up at night, is the fact that there are people who are running elections that are refusing to certify the results.
Yes.
And it delays the process. So I had a issue in the primary election last year where there was a lawsuit around mail-in voting. So in Pennsylvania, for mail-in voting, you have to sign and put a date on the back of the envelope. And a court said, not having a date on there doesn't really matter because the county gets the mail, they know what day the mail comes and they stamp it with the date. So if a person forgets the date, no big deal, that ballot should count. So I told all the counties, count ballots without dates. A lot of times, older voters forget to put a date. Some people might put their birth date. So I told counties, make sure you count those ballots. I had 3 counties that just said, no, I'm not gonna listen to you, I'm not gonna do it.
Yeah.
So they didn't certify the election. So I had to sue them. Lawsuits take time, right? And so I didn't really certify the election, I think, until months after the primary. In 2022, in November, the court then said, a different court actually said, there really should be a date on the ballot. It was a few weeks before the election. So counties, you have to make sure that there's a date on the ballot, which created all this voter confusion. And so we had to spend all these resources to educate voters, actually make sure you put that date on there. It was confusing. But in a midterm election or an off-year election, there's no deadline to certify the results. But for a presidential election, there's the Electoral College. You have to certify by what, mid-December?
Each state is different.
So that's what I'm extremely concerned about. I feel like on the election denier side, they're really doing everything they can to delay that certification. I didn't certify the results of the November election until January of 2023 because, like you mentioned, Cliff, they're resourced. They are very, very smart, despite what a lot of people think. And they use this little known provision in the election code from like 1923 that no one ever used, where you only have to pay $50, have 3 voters in a precinct sign a petition, and you can have a recount. Or It's a petition for recount. It goes to a judge to determine if the recount's going to happen or not. And a lot of judges threw it out, but some judges said, go ahead and have this recount, which takes time, which holds up, and money, and holds up certification of election results. So I just wanted to mention that to everyone. It's a little bit in the weeds, but it's something that we really have to keep an eye on as we get to 2024, because that's where the fight's going to be. If you can't certify the results, you can't put people in office. It creates chaos and confusion. It creates distrust in our election system, and it's really something that people need to be working on and thinking about in advance.
And Madam Secretary, I wanted to also ask you, when we're dealing with elections, right now we hear a lot of conversation with regards to election workers being criminally culpable for, acting or not acting and sending things out. Does the role of the Secretary of State have any influence in that at all?
You mean over election workers that are doing their jobs? Not really, it depends on the state, but there really isn't, at least in Pennsylvania, I didn't really have the authority to remove someone from their role. There were a lot of, which baffled my mind, judges of elections or people running elections that said there was fraud, but they might have been on that ballot too, or they actually ran the election. So I'm like, how are you saying there's fraud in the election that you ran? Like, it doesn't make any sense, right? But as far as, the Secretary of State, no. But one thing that was concerning is just the threats that are out there, the fact that so many election workers were threatened, their families were threatened, their lives were threatened, and it caused a lot of people to leave their jobs. In Pennsylvania alone, we had about 30 leave since 2020. There's 67 counties. We had 30 election directors leave, which is about half. And, when you're training a whole new crop of people who might not know about elections, that's when mistakes happen. So one thing that I left in the office is someone who's in charge of training those counties to make sure that they can get up to speed and know. But it's unfortunate that people who are just doing their jobs, making sure that every person's vote is counted, are being threatened and they're leaving. So.
But they were lucky to have you.
Thank you.
And I don't want to jump in, but before he jumps in, you had laid out the situation where there were 2 or 3 counties that were refusing to certify the elections in Pennsylvania. If they continue to hold out the certification, I'm just saying Arizona right now, if they continue to hold out on the certification, what anything can the Secretary of State do?
Nothing. It's really up to the courts, honestly. Yeah, it really depends. All I could do was sue them and leave it up to the courts. And depending on who's on that court,
So anyone to jump in?
Yeah, just I mentioned a story earlier. So we recently just had, as of a few weeks ago, it was just resolved a situation in Georgia where in 2020, going back to what you were saying about the food and water, some of our folks in Doherty County, southwest rural Georgia, were giving out food and water. A white woman, Trump model person, gets upset, pulls out a gun, waves around a gun, all that. They call sheriffs and all that stuff. What wound up happening was that the Secretary of State's office had to investigate complaints, not just against the woman pulling the gun out, which is like a black and white, just clear violation of you can't bring a gun into the polling place. But also investigating our staff and the other partners that we were working with, the other community members, right? So the Secretary of State's office was investigating this. And keep in mind what I said was this was the 2020 election. This was before the 2021 voter suppression bill, which outlawed giving out food and water, had even been passed. So they were essentially trying to enforce it retroactively. And this continued on with this cloud hanging over our folks for more than a year. And resulted in them ultimately bringing, recommending charges to the state board of elections, which in Georgia is now controlled by the Republican legislature, right? But then they at the last minute, they changed their minds, decided not to recommend charges against us, but to recommend charges against the woman with the gun. With that said, though, they still had to have a discussion amongst that board, the board of elections, the state board of elections, and they went through a back and forth for like half an hour, basically trying to find a way to show that our folks are wrong, even though, again, there was no law that was outlined. The woman, like half an hour to explain how the reason she had her gun was because she was so intimidated by the food and the black music that was being played. Now, so I'm saying all this to say that yes, there are situations where who's in the Secretary of State's office can dictate which complaints they investigate, what recommendations they make, and whether that, depending on the state, is a recommendation that goes to the board, or whether, because ultimately what that board of elections is doing is then making a referral to the Attorney General about whether or not to prosecute. So yes, who's in that Secretary of State's office, and who's investigating, and what charges they're recommending, all of that matters. We have got to take these Secretary of State positions and these Board of Elections at the county level. We have got to take those positions very seriously. The same way that we now look at DAs differently because of Black Lives Matter. And how, you know, we now have more of a movement where we prioritize DA elections, and we have a term that didn't even exist 7 years ago, progressive DAs. The same way that we now have a heightened understanding of the DA position, we've got to develop the same thing around these Secretary of States and these Board of Elections. And I'm just really thankful that we had you in that situation in Pennsylvania.
Absolutely.
And so as people leave here today from this panel discussion, what do they do next? I mean, what element should every group or state have as a part of their voting rights strategy for 2024? What should they do? What do you advise them to do? What is essential that they have in place to prepare for the 2024 election? Open question.
You want to start?
Sure. Who wants to start?
Let's start down the line.
Sure, I can start. Just going back to what I was saying earlier about, you know, making sure that the organization you're affiliated with is going to those critical meetings where decisions are made in your community about locations of polling places, drop boxes, what have you. And a lot of times these decisions are made last minute. I mean, there's requirements that they have to publicly have notice that these meetings are happening and these decisions are happening, but it's something that groups really need to pay attention to and be on top of, because they can notice something, you know, within 24 hours, there can be another meeting, and there needs to be people testifying on the record as far as what's going on. So I think that's going to be critical for organizations to be able to mobilize, especially as we move to 2024 when there's another voice in the room, the election denier voice, that's pushing for people to be disenfranchised.
Yes.
I would say there are many people who don't actually have a political home. And what I mean is not in a political party. I mean in an organization like TJC, like NOW, like Black Voters Matter, like the League of Women Voters. And so I'm going to do my shameless plug here, where I would invite people to go to lwv.org and become a member of the League of Women Voters. We have 765 chapters around the country, and there are various ways that you can get involved. We have a website called vote411.org, where you can find all the information about your voter registration status, where you're supposed to vote, and we work directly with people who are running for office to get the information in their own words. We do it in English and in Spanish. And so I would invite people to actually be engaged in the hands-on process. The last thing I would say is elections always happen in November. My joke is my family can't get Thanksgiving dinner if they haven't all voted. And so we talk about registering people to vote all the time, which is important. The last thing I would say is there's a report that just came out. If you go to civilrights.org, we're a member of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and a bunch of us worked really hard on a report that was just released. 2 years ago on Bloody Sunday, the president announced that his executive order on voting rights,
Right.
which basically meant that every single part of his administration was going to be responsible for doing things. So we just put that report card out on what they should be doing. So for example, if you're getting social service benefits or any kind of benefit through HHS, you should be able to register to vote. If you're engaged with the Bureau of Prisons in any way, you should be able to register to vote through their website. There are all the different pieces, and so you can find out how to make sure that you're holding those folks accountable, but also driving people towards those things, because not every solution is currently a permanent one. Sometimes we have executive orders and other things that are available to us to at least give us some kind of temporary relief. And so I would just encourage people to look at all of those things. But that report is really, really important because it's the stuff that impacts our everyday lives, right? Whether it's SBA and you're somebody who's applying for a loan, being able to go through their website to register to vote. All of these things are critically important because it touches our lives in an everyday way, and we can engage more people that way.
So I would agree that it's really important that everyone aligns with an issue-based, that everyone aligns with an org or a group that is issue-based, that they can that really aligns with them in their communities. I think that is extremely important. As well as Virginia's Legal Women Voters, now we have chapters everywhere in states, and so we also do a lot of organizing in the community. But more importantly, I think it's really important that whatever group you're aligning with, it resonates with you, and you can relate to them, and you can attach with their issues. They make sense for you, and you can be able to communicate with them. We do a lot of action alerts at the federal level, but we also do them at the national level. So what we do is make intentions to get information out. Our chapters, we send them out on how to contact legislators, how to organize, how to communicate, how to write letters. So we give step-by-step ways for our members to be able to follow the steps of what they need to do. And then we also give out grants to our chapters to help them do actions in the community to make sure they're getting out the vote on our issues, because we're nonpartisan as well. So I think it's really important to make sure that you're doing everything in your power to activate organizers and members in the community to get that word out on the vote and what's important for them on their issues, because that is the most important, to make sure that people are going out and resonating with people on issues that are impactful for them. And then I would just say, make sure too that we're like, that the Secretary of State said, it's like we're holding people accountable. Like, you can go to these all these meetings are public hearing meetings. You can attend them, you can go to them, you can ask, you put on the list to give testimony.
Right.
You can also, you can go to these things. So I think it's important that we understand our power and as citizens and voters to go to these meetings. And so feel empowered to get up and go and attend and say that I have something to say and add to this. And you can also go ahead and find out what those meetings are. They list them on the websites for your cities and your towns. So I would encourage everyone to do that. And like Legal Women Voters have their Vote 411, I always refer people there all the time, because they're a coalition partner. And so I try to tap into that. And I tap into Black Voters Matter. I tap into all the different organizations, or TJC, I tap into them. We make sure that we're aligning with our coalition partners to make sure that whoever has issues that resonate, we're doing that because we are stronger together. So I just encourage everyone to make sure, and they tap into now, so we all support each other, but just make sure that you are really activating your power in your organization, going out, getting involved. We have chapters everywhere too. Our Georgia Now chapters here, but make sure that, yes, that you're going everywhere that you need to go to really tap in, and I think that's the most important. And just holding the people accountable as much as possible. If they're not doing what you need them to do, make an appointment to their office. Show up.
Right.
Yeah, just co-signing on everything that you said. Get connected to the organization. Just like Christian, we use the Vote 401 as well in many of our states when we do our texting campaigns. And when we get that question back on the texting campaign, is there a candidate guide? Is there a voter guide? And we send them that link. So when you're looking around for what organization you're going to get connected to, that should be a question that I think that you should ask. Like, who are you in relationship with? Who are you in alignment? Who are you in collaboration with? Because no organization can do this on their own. And I'm just so, one of the blessings of the past few years of my life have been to be in coalition with all of these organizations up here. Our brother Damon that was in here earlier from the Lawyers Committee. Every time we had an action going on in D.C., they'd have our legal observers out there supporting us. We can't do this alone.
Right.
You got to be in collaboration and coordination with folks. And there's a lot of nuts and bolts things that I could say about like what to do. One thing is to recognize that the best way to prepare for 24 is by acting right now in 23.
Yes.
Arguably the most important election for 24 is happening right now in Wisconsin in 23. Because what happens with the Supreme Court race, I'm not going to go into all the details, but what happens with the Supreme Court race in Wisconsin that's taking place next month could very well determine, to Madam Secretary's point, can determine whether or not an election in Wisconsin gets certified. And so if you're not aware of the Wisconsin Supreme Court election, I suggest you get aware with it. I don't care if you live in Wisconsin, if you know somebody in Wisconsin, if you care about democracy in this country, you need to be connecting with somebody in Wisconsin, telling them they need to go vote.
That's right.
Joining an organization and sending text messages and doing phone calls, sending a donation. I could tell you a couple of black-led groups in Wisconsin that you can connect with, but you need to be concerned with what's happening in Wisconsin and some other states, but definitely what's happening with that Supreme Court race in Wisconsin. And then the last thing I'm going to say is, because there's a lot of nuts and bolts thing, but fundamentally, for us to be prepared for 23, 24, and beyond, we have got to believe that we have the power to do this.
Amen.
Right? Again, we are in Selma, where a couple of hundred folks...
Woo!
Don't get confused by the images of the Selma to Montgomery March, right?
Right.
Or by the images even tomorrow that we're going to see here, because there's going to be thousands of people going across that bridge tomorrow. It was a couple of hundred.
Right.
It was a couple of hundred on that first attempt to go
Barely
across
600.
the bridge, right? And they believed. They believed, right? We've got to believe, and if we're honest with ourselves, and if I'm honest with myself, there are days that go by where we don't really believe. Even when we do this work every day, sometimes we do it because we're hoping, because it's the right thing to do, right? Because we don't want to just not do anything. But if we're honest with ourselves, we don't really always believe. We hear the news coming out of Florida, and it's like, oh my God, we can't do nothing with Florida. We hear the news coming out of Texas. We hear the news coming out of Mississippi. We don't really believe that we can overcome the things that we're up against. We have got to believe in this work. We've got to believe in us, because at the end of the day, we all we got, right? And plus our faith, right, which has always helped us to get through. We've got to believe in our power, because our history shows us that when we believe, there's nothing that we can't do.
Right.
But when we don't have that belief, and when that belief is not rooted in the sincere, honest feelings of love and a determination for power, which we deserve, when we don't have that, then we lose.
Yes.
But when we have those ingredients and then we work together, our history shows us there's nothing that we can't do.
Amen.
And so everybody in here has a role to play. There's usually a story I tell, and it's a little bit of a long story. I'm going to do the abbreviated version, because Barbara mentioned the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson.
My Lord.
Right? And the night that Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered was because there was a nighttime rally, which was always a dangerous thing. But the essence of the nighttime rally was that there was somebody in jail, that they were trying to get out of jail, not in Selma, but in nearby Perry County. It's about a half an hour away.
That's correct.
The person that was in jail, his name was James Orange. James Orange was a young organizer who had got connected with the movement because he was from Birmingham, and he was a young teenager that was involved in the Birmingham's Children March. That's how he got connected.
Wow.
But the way he got connected to the march was because there was a church meeting that he went to, not so much because he wanted to be in the children's march, but because there was a young lady he was interested in. And so he goes to the meeting, and when the moment comes when they're asking for volunteers, she stands up, and so he's like, hell, I'm going to stand up too, right? And so James Orange, who would later become Reverend James Orange,
Yes.
right? A mentor to many of us in this movement, a union organizer, and so much more. It was this teenager, James Orange, which stood up for whatever reason he stood up, got involved for whatever reason he got involved, went to Perry County, got arrested, led to a meeting, which led to the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, which is the direct thing that led to the Selma to Montgomery March.
Right.
And so I go through that story to say that it's the actions of one person sometimes can set off a ripple that we don't know where it's going to end up. James Orange didn't know that him getting involved in Birmingham would set off a chain reaction that would lead to the Voting Rights Act. Again, changing this country and changing this world and motivating people all across the world, right? So the question for all of us sitting here, which one of us here, just by taking one action, just by standing up, just by taking part in one action, which one of us here might set off a chain reaction that can change this country?
Ken.
Every one of us in here has the ability to do that just by taking one action, just by standing up, just by taking one step. But we've got to believe that we've got that power, right? And so don't take that action because you're trying to see how it's going to change the world. Take the next right step and believe in that next right step. And if we all do that, they can't stop us.
My. My.
Barbara, I'm going to close this out. It's been a phenomenal panel.
Woo!
Just a phenomenal discussion.
Goodness.
And I certainly want to thank all of our panelists for your participation. It's just been, just incredible information that has been relayed and transmitted to many of the people that have been here in attendance. So, Barbara, would you like to?
Yes. Yes, a couple of things. First of all, can you hear me? First of all, thank you, Daryl Jones, for just being a superb moderator. All this, and also, all that setup you saw, the posters, he did that too. And all the other work that you've done just to make this an incredible day. And it's been an incredible day. And I am so glad, and thank you to all of you who have shown up and who are here. I just want to say a couple things to Daryl's question. If you subscribe to the TJC's The Transformer, our erstwhile newsletter, it comes out almost every week.